Mr. Streisfield, you're on.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. May I, sir? Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Lee. First of all, you should have in front of you a document that says Exhibit 33.
Yep.
Okay. And in Exhibit 33, I'm going to walk you through it shortly, but in Exhibit 3, if you could just pull yourself up to tab 9.
Yep.
You have the May 13th, 2020 staff report.
Yes.
And if I go to the second page of the staff report, so it says contact person, Patrick Lee, Director, Policy Planning.
Mm-hmm.
Are you the author of this report?
No, it's kind of a team effort, to be honest with you. There were a number of people that, had a hand in it. Brian DeFreitas in the policy section, his manager, Saban Von Kersel, Joanne Leung had the urban design part of it. Dan Terziewski and Hubert Ing had parts of the transportation. In the end, I have a certain editorial control over the content of the report, as does the Commissioner of Planning, Kelvin Kwan. So it's a team effort in terms of the preparation of the report. The contact person, that's the name that is put on the report. Basically, if councillors have questions, they know who to ask the questions of.
Do I take it there's no, you are the policy planner for the city?
I'm the Director of Policy Planning, yes.
Is there a higher policy planner in the city than you?
No, there isn't.
Right, okay. And secondary plans and zoning bylaws would fall under policy planning?
The zoning bylaws generally don't. The secondary plans most certainly. In this instance, the zoning bylaw was put together by the zoning bylaw team, in close consultation with the policy staff.
Okay. Now, I take it you are aware of proposed modifications to the versions of the secondary plan and zoning bylaw that arose after May 2020?
Changes that arose after May 2020?
Yes.
Generally, yes.
Okay, so in this particular hearing, for example, there were some proposed changes to, we call it Exhibit 34, but that's to the Part 1 plan.
Yes.
And Exhibit 35 represented changes to this proposed secondary plan.
Right.
Okay. And we'll come to those in a second. I just wanted to take a step back and just ask the general question, why in an intensification area where it is known that there is a high water table, why the plan did not suggest at the outset that stratification should be required in order for the plan to actually get built out? Like, why was that concept not introduced at the outset? Like, to me, and then, do you understand, to me, it's an obvious. You get that?
Yeah. I just want to, before we go any further, and I'll admit I've only been subpoenaed once before. The once before, yes, others get to ask questions. And this is a question to the tribunal, if I may. The questions that were asked of other lawyers other than the subpoenaing lawyer had to relate to the questions asked by the subpoenaing lawyer, who's
You should go through your counsel.
And I just don't know the question to that. So, you know, Mr. Cherniak asked me a series of questions, and I get it that everybody gets to ask me questions related to what he asked me. There was nothing about water table. So I just want to understand from a procedural perspective if Mr. Streisfield's question is appropriate. And I'm happy to answer it, but I'm just asking that question.
This is normal. Examination then cross.
It's not normal examination, cross-examination. So unless you have something to contribute, Mr. Cosner?
Yes, Mr. Chair, just to put this in some context, Mr. Lee is here testifying pursuant to a summons that was issued at the request of Mr. Cherniak.
Yep.
Mr. Cherniak was the one who put Mr. Lee on his witness list. Mr. Cherniak was the one who prepared a will say statement setting out in some detail the areas of examination where he intended to go with Mr. Lee. So on that basis, Mr. Lee was given some notice of the areas that he would be expected to cover in his examination. Not so with Mr. Streisfield. He did not request a summons. He did not put Mr. Lee on his witness list, and we have no equivalent of a will say statement that gave any prior notice to the witness as to the specific areas where Mr. Streisfield intended to go on his cross-examination. So in my respectful submission and in fairness to the witness, there should be a much more limited latitude for Mr. Streisfield to pursue lines of questioning that do not arise as cross-examination from the questions that were put by Mr. Cherniak. I'm not suggesting that it should be the four corners of that by any means, but I'm just saying before we venture into other areas that Mr. Cherniak did not explore at all, I think we need to be very careful in fairness to this witness in my submission.
Fairness, I agree.
I'm not sure what that means in terms of my my question.
Next
The questions
question.
that I'm asked.
Just limit your questions to him to the questions that Mr. Cherniak has already covered.
Well,
He's not yours, not your witness.
well, I wouldn't know. Well, I would take objection to that. That's in my respectful submission. That's not appropriate, especially since I'm going to deal with issues that arise directly from the staff report where he's the main policy contact person. I don't know how my cross could be limited to anything that would arise from Mr. Cherniak, since his questions have nothing to do with my questions.
Well, again, Mr. Chair, this gets into a basic issue of procedural fairness. There's rules that are set out, and in my submission, counsel are expected to play by those rules. That's what Mr. Cherniak did. And I think we need to be very careful in fairness to the witness from a procedural fairness standpoint, and to the city's case and the case of parties of like interest, before we give carte blanche to cross-examine a witness under subpoena by one counsel on questions for which that witness had no prior notice or ability to anticipate that he would be called to give evidence on.
Well,
I think the panel's view is that you could have summoned Mr. Lee and you didn't. And therefore I agree, and the chair agrees that Mr. Lee is put at a significant disadvantage not knowing what questions you're going to ask him, because it's effectively cross, right? And so you should not have any latitude to go beyond the materials he's already covered under cross by Mr. Cherniak.
Next question. We agree.
okay, so I just want to make sure that my objection is noted, that that is My objection is noted. I just don't know where that could come from. Anyways, did you approve a policy that now introduces stratification into the plan? It's a factual question.
Did I? Yes, I did. I mean, it'll be the LPAT that approves the policy ultimately, but yes, I agreed with that policy, yes.
Okay. And so just taking a step back, my question was, why is it that that concept was not introduced back in 2017, or at least not back in May of 2020? That's my question.
I thought that was already asked by Mr. Cherniak and answered.
We're heading down a real dangerous road again.
Well, you
Well, I know we are, because this,
don't agree with you on that one.
no, I realize that, but I'm saying that we're
Okay.
going down a dangerous road again because, first of all, the general rule is that when a witness is summoned, there's no restriction on the amount of cross-examination. So I'm just saying, so this would be a departure from
Procedural
the norm.
fairness demands otherwise, I think, in this. It's okay.
To who or to what?
To the witness.
But I'm asking him a question about the very policies that now are getting added in.
I'm not sure. I don't recall whether Mr. Cherniak even asked a question about stratification. Did you, Mr. Cherniak? Forgive me if you did.
No, Madam Chair.
He did not even ask about stratification, which is the issue you're asking him about now. And he has no notice that you are going to ask him about that issue.
Well, it's cross. I don't give him my cross-examination and notes in advance. I'm sincerely, I really just don't understand this ruling. To me,
Mr. Cherniak did. So next question.
I think your last answer is that you were provided with a draft of a stratification policy, which, when I say you approved,
I
you
agreed
agreed
with,
with.
yes.
Oh, okay. Can we now move from that point on? And that stratification policy is found in Exhibit 35. Well, I just don't understand how there's no case to argue here, because we can't get any answers on any subject that we've been going at this at the same time. I really have never been restricted cross-examination before. It just, there's nothing to answer here. We
You
might
are
as well go
now, you
home.
are now in these circumstances where he was brought in. under
Okay, as long,
subpoena by Mr. Cherniak.
I don't know what that has to do with anything.
Move on.
Please ask the next question.
Who drafted the stratification policy which you signed off on?
I think by and large, it was Mr. Terziewski.
Ah, okay. And so to your knowledge, is Mr. Terziewski, is he a policy planner?
No, he's not, but his group is dealing with the city's stratification study, which is underway, and I think it's been alluded to in this hearing. It's a document that's not complete, so their group tends to know a little bit more about that sort of stuff than us policy planners do.
Okay. When I read, tell me if I got this right, when I read the staff report, there are at least 3 studies that are referred to. Obviously, they aren't complete because they're underway. One of them is the parking study. The second one is a stratification study. And I think the third one is, there's a housing study.
Affordable housing.
Affordable housing study. So we have 3 studies that are underway, and is it your view that we don't need any of the answers to those studies? We should just approve the secondary plan with any proposed modifications that the city has proffered through Exhibit 34 and Exhibit 35.
Mr. Chair, based on the earlier discussion, and I kept mostly silent because I had to think a little bit about it, but I do think that it is unfair to allow Mr. Streisfield to go into issues that I did not deal with at all, because it would be equally unfair for other parties to use this as an opportunity to open up every opinion that this witness might have when the city could have called him. So.
You mean I can't ask him questions on Exhibit 35?
I'm sure what Exhibit 35 is.
Oh, those are all of the amendments that were put in by the city with the support of some landowners and not others.
So, Mr. Chair, the appropriate issues on Exhibit 35 would relate to height and density and the holding provisions, because that was what I asked about.
And that was the areas covered by Mr. Cherniak. Okay. So go ahead.
Are you saying I can't even ask him a question about the bus terminal?
By Mr. Cherniak at all.
It doesn't matter whether it was raised. I want to know if I can ask this witness a question about
matter. Nope.
No?
Nope.
Okay, my objection is noted in that.
You
My questions are overdone. You proceed. You have my objection. My view, you've conducted a completely unfair and unrealistic.
Thank you very
hearing
much.
beyond
We don't
belief.
need you. Don't need
Go
that
ahead.
any further.
Go ahead. Go ahead. I'm done.
Not taking
No,
your
no,
direction.
you can't. We cannot
you,
ask
Mr.
a proper
Streisfield.
question to the witness. It's ridiculous.
You've heard it
Sir,
for
we've
several
noted-
times.
And we've noted your objection. Could you kindly
No.
just either keep quiet or ask a next question?
I have nothing to ask
Good.
because
Okay.
you've cut me off and we can't even get to proper answers here. Again, just
Mr.
continuing pattern.
Streisfield, thanks. Stop it now.
Okay.
So in the procedure now, you're on, Mr. Kussner. Is that correct?
I believe it would actually be Ms. Foran and
Oh,
Mr. Kagan and
I'm sorry.
Mr.
Okay.
Ruddick if they have any questions.
I didn't.
I think the city's limited to redirect under the protocol that we agreed to.
Anyone else out there of like?
Yes, sir, it's Foran. I have only a couple of questions that relate to the questions put to the witness by Mr. Cherniak, so I'll be guided by your direction. Good afternoon, Mr. Lee. As you know, I represent Yonge MCD Inc. I want to take you back to an area that Mr. Cherniak asked you about before the lunch break, and it related to the definition of urban squares and the reference to urban squares in the city's Part 1 official plan. Do you recall those questions, sir?
I do.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, might I be able to just share my screen for a moment?
Sure. Oh.
Bear with. That was supposed to be better. I think it should come up. There we go. Mr. Lee, I hope you can see the screen that I'm sharing with you. It's the reference to urban squares in the Part 1 official plan that Mr. Cherniak took you to this morning.
Yes, I can see it.
And sir, he took you to the first sentence under the definition of urban squares. And he asked you to confirm in your evidence that there was no definition of urban plaza in the city's official plan. And you indicated that there was no a separate definition of urban plazas. Do you recall that?
I do.
Okay, I want to take you to the balance of that reference in the city's official plan with respect to urban squares, and in particular ask you to focus for a moment on the second sentence where it refers to urban squares may take the form of public or private courtyards, mews, plazas, or other similar urban meeting places that provide opportunities for people to gather, reflect, and interact with one another. Do you see that, sir?
I do.
And in your opinion, sir, does the concept of urban plazas that has now been brought forward in addition to linear parks in the city's secondary plan conform with the concept of urban squares in the Part 1 plan?
I think it does. And the second sentence under urban squares describes those many forms that they can take. So I believe it does.
All right. And then if I could just take you down further to another section that Mr. Cherniak did not take you to in the concept of his discussion of parks, and I'm looking now for a moment, sir, at section 16, where there is a reference to private urban squares created through the development approval process, which are encouraged to be
So,
to
Mr.
provide
Chair,
public access. Do you see that, sir?
Sorry, Ms. Foran, I'm going to object. So this is a party that is of like interest with the city.
Yes.
And although it is not technically a re-exam, it is not technically a cross-exam either. I don't think it's appropriate for Ms. Foran to be telling the witness which policies he should be referring to. I think it should be more of a clarification and asking which policies other than the one I brought him to he wants to refer to.
Mr. Chairman, it's Foran. I did not actually get to my question yet, so perhaps I could be permitted to actually ask it in reference to the policy that I've taken the witness to, if I may.
Right.
Mr. Lee, in your opinion, does the city's secondary plan and the provision for urban plazas conform with that policy in section 16?
Yes, it does.
All right, thank you. Now, you were asked by Mr. Cherniak with respect to the zoning bylaw, and I appreciate your evidence with respect to the perhaps a little bit more of remoteness for you with respect to the drafting of the bylaw. He asked you, sir, about whether the zoning bylaw capped the population for the secondary plan area. Do you recall that, sir?
I do.
All right, and you had made a suggestion about the holding provision, and he sort of scrolled through it very quickly. And I wanted to just bring you back to the holding provision for a moment, sir, if I may.
Yes.
Can you see it there on the screen?
Not yet. Give it a second. Still can't see it.
Bear with me. Oh, sorry. I have to screen share again. My apologies. There we go. Can you see it now, sir?
I can, yes.
All right, so I'm just taking you back to section 5.34 of the zoning bylaw, which is the holding provision section.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to give you a moment, sir, just to review that section in its entirety, sir, because you had made a reference to the holding provision and the relationship between population and jobs. And I think your conclusion was that perhaps it was only found in the official plan. Do you recall that?
I do, yes.
And with the benefit of the opportunity now to review that section again, can you perhaps just advise the tribunal whether in fact the zoning bylaw does in fact carry forward the H as we see it in the secondary plan?
It carries forward the H, but it doesn't seem that it prescribes the sort of numbers of units or persons and jobs that can be provided until the holds are lifted.
Right, and can I just direct you for a moment, sir, to sub 5, where there's a reference to the transportation planning study?
I see that, yeah.
All right, and sir, there's a reference there to a requirement for that to be filed in accordance and as prescribed in section 12.5.4.21 of the official plan. Do you see that?
I do.
All right, and sir, would it assist you if I put that section of the OP up in front of you?
Sure, thank you.
Okay. Don't know if I can do them both at the same time. You have to bear with me. I think. Do you see that, sir?
The new one's not up yet.
Okay, there we go. Sorry. I'm going to have to get better with this, I think. Sorry. There we go. That's section 12.5.4.2, which was just referenced in the zoning bylaw. Do you see it, sir?
Yes.
That's in the secondary plan.
Yep.
And can I ask you, sir, if I just scroll down with you in this section, if you can confirm for the tribunal whether in fact, by reference to this section, the overall holding provisions that we see in the OP are also reflected now in the zoning bylaw?
They are. The zoning bylaw reflects you back to what's on the screen now, basically.
All right, and are you satisfied therefore that what is contemplated by the secondary plan in fact will also bind development applications as they come forward pursuant to the zoning bylaw?
Yes, I am.
All right, you'll be happy to know, Mr. Lee, that I'm not going to share my screen for my next question. But you may recall that you were taken to a table that Mr. Cherniak brought to your attention from 2017 that detailed the original applications in the KDA area. They included private applications, not only by Mr. Kagan's client, but by my client and by other landowners. Recall that, sir?
Yes, I do.
All right. And were you able to sit in for or review the evidence of Mr. Ryan Gooder, who was the land use planner that I called on behalf of Yonge MCD?
Unfortunately, I didn't.
All right. He provided detailed evidence respecting the changes in my client's applications between the time of their original proposal, then what was ultimately approved following the tertiary plan that was adopted after the secondary plan in 2018, and then what's now ultimately to be approved by way of settlement for the tribunal. Sir, would you defer to him in terms of the details with respect to the Yonge MCD development application?
How is that proper? Objection. How is that proper?
Mr. Streisfield, do you want to stay out of this one?
No, I don't see how it's proper. I'm objecting. How that line of questioning is proper about anything.
Calm down.
Okay. Here's the first thing. I need to put everybody on.
I think Mr. Streisfield is still on mute. I'm unable to hear him.
Thank you. Okay, so first of all, I just want to put the tribunal on notice. Tomorrow morning at 9:30 a.m., I will bringing a motion for recusal against this tribunal. Okay? Tomorrow morning at 9:30. I want to put everybody on notice. I've been cut off way too many times.
Very much.
Thank you.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Mr. Lee, my question was with respect to the details of the changes in the Yonge MCD development applications. Would you defer to Mr. Gooder's evidence in that respect?
Hard for me to say, given I didn't hear his evidence, if I defer to it. You know, I am assuming that Mr. Gooder knows what, how many units and stories and densities that his client wanted.
He's not being helpful.
That's fine, sir. One last question. Mr. Cherniak asked you about the change in the secondary plan from 2017 to what is now being put forward before the tribunal for approval as it related to the height regime. And you may recall that you were asked a number of questions by him with respect to what he called the policy-based regime that is now found in the secondary plan as proposed to be approved by the tribunal. Recall those questions?
I do.
Right. And so you made references, for example, to the inclusion of the 45-degree angular plane. Can I just ask you, sir, for your opinion with respect to the use of a policy-based regime as opposed to height schedules that restrict height as it relates to impacts on surrounding lands and residents in the area?
So the use of a policy based height limit, what it does is it introduces, as I mentioned this morning, something less subjective, something more technical, something that's measurable to determine whether there's impacts on adjacent areas from the height of buildings. So we felt that this was a good way to go. And as I mentioned earlier, it provides for some flexibility for landowners to build buildings of different heights. It also provides an opportunity for what might be somewhat taller buildings, wherein you could have lesser buildings and more open space in the area. Provides flexibility for greater variations in urban design and the overall look of the community once it starts to build out. So, you know, that's why we went to this policy-based height regime.
All right, thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Those are my questions.
Was it Mr. Kagan who was next?
Yes, sir. As a result of me having to miss all of Mr. Lee's evidence going over to the Toronto Rail Deck case. I really am not in a position to ask him any questions, so I will not be doing so.
Is there anyone else out there in the 15 participants?
No questions from the region, sir.
Okay. Anyone else?
Mr. Kustner had a third name.
I'm sorry?
You gave us a third name?
I wasn't sure whether Mr. Ruddick had any questions for TSMJC.
No questions from me, no.
Oh, okay. Anyone else now? Final? Mr. Kustner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, Mr. Lee.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Lee, you'll recall, sorry, can you hear me okay?
I can.
You'll recall when Mr. Cherniak was asking you questions about the parks policies in the secondary plan as proposed. He took you to a document entitled the Richmond Hill Parks Plan. You recall that?
I do, yes.
And he put to you the question that your parks and urban plazas that we see in the 2010 official plan continues into the Richmond Hill Parks Plan, and you answered in the affirmative. You recall that?
Yes.
My question is, what, in your understanding, is the status of the Richmond Hill Parks Plan in the overall planning hierarchy?
It's a non-statutory document that helps inform parks planning and development, now and into the future. It's not a document that, each and every planning application or planning study needs to or should specifically conform to. Because of the nature of a citywide parks plan, it's a very directional document on how the city should plan for and acquire parkland, purchase parkland, what type of parks the city needs, whether they be, right down from neighborhood parkettes all the way up to destination parks and every other park category in between. It's kind of a self-determination document, and it's not one in my mind that is appropriate for every planning exercise to take direct heed from.
Okay, and can you assist us with to what extent this directional document, the Parks Plan, did or didn't inform the preparation of the parks policies in the proposed secondary plan as modified, as proposed to be modified?
I'd have to say it was somewhat limited. It's a bit of a tough question to answer. I don't recall sort of going back and scanning through the parks plan to figure out what the parks policies of the secondary plan should be. I guess my overall answer would be, the parks plan was used in a very limited fashion at best to determine the park policies of the secondary plan.
Sorry.
Sorry, I can't hear, sir.
He's just fixing it.
Can you hear me now?
I can.
Why, in your opinion, was it of limited involvement in preparing the secondary plan modifications?
As I mentioned, the parks plan is a high-level citywide document that's kind of more self-directing to city staff and the parks that they should acquire in the future on a citywide basis. So once you get down to a small planning area, as I mentioned this morning, it's more appropriate to consider the local context and how it'll function rather than a broader citywide direction.
Thank you. And just lastly, in this area, you'll recall when Mr. Cherniak was putting to you the distinction between an urban square and an urban plaza, you responded at one point, what you call them is not that important. What's more important is how they function, how they relate to surrounding development is most important. You recall that?
I do.
And sure.
Sorry, Mr. Cussers, do you want to repeat the question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. You recall that in response to one of those questions, it was your evidence, what you call them is not that important. What's more important is how they function, how they relate to the surrounding development is most important. You recall that?
I recall that.
And my question is, with that in mind, do you have an overall opinion on the extent of similarity or differences between urban square and urban plaza?
I do. There really isn't much of a difference, in my opinion. You know, whether it's an urban square or an urban plaza, the policy direction behind it was that it can be public, it can be private. It'll have the same function. It might be largely hardscaped. It could be softscaped. These are small gathering spaces, like the policy says, you know, to provide, you know, some respite from the overall building condition, to provide for some interesting urban design, places to gather, that sort of thing. So, you know, in my opinion, I don't see a big difference between the two.
Thank you. You recall Mr. Cherniak was asking you questions about the assumptions that were used in the staff report with respect to the average unit size.
Yes.
And he put to you the proposition that there was other information suggesting that the actual average size of a condominium unit in the GTA was closer to, I believe it was 683 square feet. You recall that?
I do.
And on that basis, he asked you whether you thought the assumption of 110 square meter, sorry.
I did not make any suggestion as to other evidence. I only asked, would you agree with me that the average is closer to 650 square feet? And then the witness said he did.
Yep.
Hear the question because I'm not sure where Mr. Kussner is going with this.
I'm sorry if I misstated the basis for the question, but I think it's acknowledged that there was another document that was the basis for that figure. But be that as it may, my question had nothing to do with that in any event. My question was simply, he asked you on that basis whether, in your opinion, the assumption of an average unit size of 110 square meters or 1184 square feet was realistic. And you recall your response was, it was a little bit high. You recall that?
I do, yes.
And my question is, in your opinion, to what extent does that have a bearing on the validity or invalidity of the underlying analysis, in your opinion?
I guess where it comes into play is in terms of the number of units that the plan will have in relation to the overall FSI that's permitted. So if there's an assumption of large units, then you're going to have fewer units overall. If the assumption is smaller units, you will have more.
does that or does that not give you cause for concern in terms of the regime that was established under the proposed secondary plan modifications?
As I mentioned this morning, it doesn't give me concern, largely based on whatever sort of unit sizes the future brings for us. We really don't know for sure what those are going to be. What we did do in relation to the residents' concern was, instead of having sort of a holding threshold based on FSI, we based it on people and jobs. And so therefore, the unit sizes become irrelevant once we, if we track the number of people and jobs and we exceed a certain number, then no further development can occur until the modal splits are where they need to be and the other transportation improvements are in place. So overall, it doesn't give me any cause for concern.
Okay, and more specifically, in reference to the actual number of residents, Mr. Cherniak put to you the proposition that the actual number of residents within the KDA could be significantly higher than the highest threshold used in the proposed holding bylaw provision. You recall that? The 12,500?
Yes.
And your answer was, we don't know that. It depends on a variety of factors you mentioned, such as PPUs, but you did acknowledge that it could be higher. You recall that?
I do.
And again, can you indicate to what extent that concerns you in terms of the proposed regime and why or why not?
Okay. The reason why it doesn't concern me is that, those numbers represent a theoretical build out, and my experience is that very often theoretical build outs, we never quite get there. And then secondly, by the time we got to those numbers, 12,600 or whatever it was, it's going to, in my opinion, be quite some time in the future. And by that point in time, we're probably operating under a different secondary plan or a completely different provincial policy direction. There will be further planning done in this area and in Richmond Hill by the time we get even close to that number. So on that basis, I'm not concerned about the possibility of the number of persons and jobs being somewhat greater than 12,600. I'm just not, it just gives me no cause for concern.
Those are all my questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, moving right along.
Should we clarify that?
The schedule, sorry.
It refers to
More cross-examination by Mr. Cherniak. I presume made re-examination at this stage.
So that was what the city and I agreed was not necessary. So the next, well, so we're done with this, Mr. Lee.
Okay. And we got another Mr. Lee.
We do. I've been communicating with him. He was supposed to start at 4. Most recently, he said he would be ready at 2:30. I can ask him about 2:15 if you like.
Okay, give it a shot.
Thank you to miss this, Mr. Lee. Thank you.
May I be excused now?
Okay.
Thank you. Tomorrow morning, I would like to return a motion for recusal at 9:30 a.m. Can we slot 2 hours for that hearing of my motion for recusal, sir? Can we slot 2 hours for tomorrow morning for my motion for recusal?
We'll get an answer in a minute.
Mr.
So,
Chair, sorry, go ahead.
I think it's just helpful to know that Mr. Lee says 2:30 is the earliest he can do.
Okay.
So I would suggest that maybe Mr. Streisfield takes some time during the break to talk to the other council before he makes a final decision.
what do I need to?
I also just wanted to note, Mr. Chair, I have a serious concern if my friend Mr. Streisfield is purporting to bring a recusal motion with no notice or any written materials being circulated to any parties in advance. This is possibly the most serious motion that could be brought in connection with an ongoing hearing.
Yep.
It basically seeks to invalidate more than 3
Right.
weeks of evidence that we've heard to date.
Mhm.
And in my respectful submission, I think it's incumbent upon council before bringing such a serious motion of that nature to ensure that advance notice is given to all parties who may be opposing that motion, who will be opposing that motion, with supporting evidence with respect to the grounds that he intends to rely on in support of that motion, so that we're not effectively flying by the seat of our pants and dealing purely with oral submissions brought in the heat of the moment.
Well,
So if I can just finish, in my respectful submission, I don't think it should be open to my friend to bring such a motion without sufficient prior notice to the parties and without at least a notice of motion that articulates the specific grounds upon which he intends to rely in support of that motion.
Absolutely, and I will deliver the notice
Would
of
you,
motion.
hang on a minute.
Absolutely. But Mr. Kussner is not going to.
Sir.
Mr. Will you cease? We, first of all, I think we should give some opportunity for the suggestion by Mr. Cherniak, and then we will respond shortly after a break, and we will advise Mr. Streisfield what he should be doing in terms of bringing a motion.
Mr. Chairman, there may have been others like myself who wanted to weigh in a bit on Mr. Streisfield's request to bring a motion at 9:30 tomorrow morning and set aside 2 hours. If you need to hear from us before you retire, I'd like to be given that opportunity. If you don't think you need to hear from us, I respect your position.
Before the commencement.
Do you want to just say it on the screen? Well, should we give you the opportunity to have a discussion as Mr. Cherniak has suggested with Mr. Streisfield, and then we will proceed from there? I think we'll do that. And Mr. Cherniak, you said 2:30.
Right, so
Your
if,
witness would be.
so if we were to come back at 2:15, that should be time to deal with Mr. Streisfield's suggestion before the
Okay,
witness.
if you feel that's enough time, sure.
I would defer to other counsel on that, but Mr. Kussner.
So why don't we come back at 2:30 and we'll deal with the request of Mr. Streisfield. Give you that time.